Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is a really simple point and I'm not going to make this into a long video, I really mean that this time. But quite simply, this channel and many other channels out there, whether it's Raphael over at Metatron or Lindy Beige or whoever, we do a lot of comparison of X versus Y, don't we? And one of the reasons we do that, let's be honest about it, is because it's popular, okay? It's what a lot of people watching YouTube want to see. They want to see katana versus longsword or, you know, I don't know, troll versus dwarf, I don't know. But there's a lot of comparison videos made. But one thing I want to reiterate, and obviously I've made this point before, but I really want to make it clearly and remind you of the fact, is with swords, when we're comparing them, the context there, I've got the word in soon, but the context of their use is extremely important when we're comparing them, specifically in regard to whether they're supposed to be used alone or not. Okay, so when we're looking at swords like perhaps a long sword or a saber, those are, of course, predominantly used alone. Yes, some people might go, but a saber is often used with a firearm. Yeah, okay. But in terms of hand weapons, a saber is usually used by itself. A long sword's usually used by itself. Small swords, rapiers, for the most part, back swords. So cutlasses, most of these swords are used by themselves. But there is a whole other breed of swords which weren't predominantly historically used by themselves. There are some of them right next to me here. So whilst tulwars were used by themselves, okay, in some scenarios, they weren't really necessarily optimized for that, and they weren't, certainly in the earlier period until firearms became very prevalent, they weren't predominantly used by themselves. They were used with shields. And obviously, if we're comparing a sword like the Viking era sword, or if we go further back into history, if we look at Bronze Age swords, Iron Age swords, or Roman and Greek era swords, classical world swords, all of these are supposed to be used with shields. That instantly makes any comparison kind of ridiculous, okay, because a sword that's supposed to be used by itself has to fulfill the role of attack and defense, generally speaking. Whereas a sword that is used with a shield or some other companion thing, and it is usually shields historically speaking, shields or bucklers, then of course the shield or the buckler is predominantly defending and the sword is predominantly attacking. And indeed, it's entirely possible that the conventional way of using a Viking era sword in the Viking era was for the sword to be barely used for any defensive actions at all. It's entirely possible, and not to say that that was always the case, and in fact I would definitely use the sword personally for some defensive actions, but I'm a 21st century HEMA person with the benefit of centuries of knowledge of fencing science behind. A person in the 8th, 9th, 10th century using one of these swords with a shield would predominantly defend with the shield whilst trying to hit with the sword. And we must also remember, as mentioned, that that is true of many types of tulwars. So, for example, this, I've specifically picked up this tulwar, which normally sits on the wall behind me, because it's a particularly long and quite heavy blade. This is quite a chopper of a massive curved Shamshir style blade. And it's not at all suited to sort of fencing with by itself. It's not really, I mean, yes, I can use it by itself, but it's not catered towards that. It's catered towards dealing out whopping great chops, which, although it's a very different shape, so is this. Similarly with the Roman gladius. The Roman gladius, look at its size, look at its shape, look at its hand protection. It's predominantly there to give cuts and thrusts, while a massive shield, a scutum in this case, does the job of protecting you. And the short sword is designed to get around. It's got nice tight angles you can get with such a short blade, to get around either with the point or the edge, to get around the opposing scutum or large shield, that era being dominated by the use of large shields, of course. We should also mention in passing as well things like rapiers rapiers were used by themselves, but they were very often used with a companion weapon, most often a dagger, but sometimes a cloak, sometimes a buckler, sometimes a shield, rotella, or various other things. And indeed, if we're talking about side swords, for example, so the kind of slightly later descendant of the medieval arming sword, they were predominantly used with bucklers. If we look at any of the side sword sources, at least the earlier ones, Manciolino Marozzo, and so on, Dall'Agocchi, they are dominated by the use of the buckler in conjunction with the sword, despite the fact that they're starting to see more spada sola, or sword by itself, coming in as more and more of a thing, probably because civilians couldn't be bothered to carry around a buckler or whatever, and they were having the sword by itself predominantly. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I've done, I hope, what I promised and kept this fairly concise by Matt Easton standards anyway. But we must remember when we're comparing swords that just if we want to just make it simple into a simple division of two things, there are swords which are meant to be used predominantly by themselves, and there are swords which are meant to be used predominantly with another thing, which is usually a shield, sometimes a dagger or a buckler. Okay, so, and those are two separate breeds of swords. That's completely aside from one-handed or two-handed, which also breaks those down further. Okay, so swords used by themselves, swords not used by themselves, and the way that we measure and judge and view those swords should really be by a really different set of criteria. I hope that's been thought-provoking for some of you, and I will see you really soon for another video. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.